Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 576. Releasing December 7 in select Australian cinemas is Revenge, Our Dad, the Nazi Killer, a documentary that explores the secret life of Boris Green, a respected patriarch, partisan, and Holocaust survivor who may have taken part in revenge killings against Nazis living in Australia. An absorbing documentary that engrosses with every twist-filled revelation. Revenge, Our Dad, the Nazi Killer, also marks the latest film from director Danny Ben-Moshe. I'm glad to say he joins me now on the podcast. Danny, how are you today?
Hi, good to be here. Thank you for your interest in talking about revenge.
Well, this is a movie that when I saw I had an email got sent to me, and I read the synopsis. And if I didn't see the word documentary, you could have been forgiven the fact there could have been some type of almost like a fictional film in a certain way, because we have seen a lot of movies and TV shows as such of like kind of thing, but this was like real life like thing happened. Not only that real life thing that happened like in our backyards, right? And it's just the interest that just grew so much more. What's really fascinating about this story, though, is that I heard in the interview you say before that you don't really find stories, the stories kind of find you. And that was the case with Revenge as well. So how was the case that this story found you? What was the scenario in regards to that?
So it was almost 5 years ago to the day. It was Christmas Day. I'm Jewish, so it's just a regular day for me. And no big family gatherings or meals or anything like that. But it's summer in Australia, and I was down at the beach house. Very content lying on the couch reading a book. Some friends came over and they were invited to some other people for a barbecue. And they said, listen, these other people whose house was in the sort of similar beach area in Victoria said we could come too. I really didn't want to go along because I was content with my book. And also, as a filmmaker, you kind of find that when people say, what do you do? They go, oh, I've got an idea for you. And you have to politely explain why that film is not a film, that film idea. And then you kind of have the same conversations about the films you've made. Anyway, as a concession to the people who were in my home, I said I'd go along for an hour just to sort of be polite. And I did. And needless to say, the conversation turned to, what do you do? And then it turned to, well, what have you made? And I'd recently made a film called Strictly Jewish, excuse me, for SBS. And I just mentioned that. And then someone piped up, hey, my car was in your film. And it turned out this was Jack, Boris's son. And there was a shot of his car going down the street, coincidentally, in the Strictly Jewish documentary. Anyway, had the barbecue, went home, that was it. About a week later, I get a phone call from Jack. Say, oh, listen, I was wondering if you could have your help with something. So I just presumed here was coming the film pitch. And he said, listen, I'm a doctor and I'm really busy, but I'm investigating this story about my dad. And you're a filmmaker, so you do research. Can I employ you to do some research for me? To which I politely explained, listen, I'm not a researcher for hire, but tell me what it is that you need researched, and I'll see if I can think of someone who can help you. And he goes, well, my dad passed away just a few years ago, and I was recently sitting around with my older brothers and my older cousin, and they started talking about this time Dad went to Sydney in the 1950s to kill a Nazi. And I'm like, whoa, what? And so the long story short is I said, listen, could we meet? So he wasn't pitching me a film idea, but when he mentioned it to me, and here we are 5 years later with a documentary that tells the tale.
So there are three brothers. There's Jack, there's John, and there's Sam. Jack's the youngest. I mean, from what I remember from the film, Boris was like 50, I think, when Jack was born.
Yeah, early
Around about.
50s. Early 50s, yeah.
So my impression with Jack is that, because he's the one that's really kind of pushing to find out what was happening with Boris at that time, my impression of him was that maybe his relationship with his father was very different to kind of like his brothers at that time, because maybe when Boris in his 50s maybe a little more mellowed out when he was younger from the indications of his older brothers. So for Jack, was he this kind of like a sort of way to kind of like know more about his father? Is that pretty much where this was coming from?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but that would be the conclusion that I would reach or have reached. And I think, yeah, I mean, if you remember when, I don't know how old your memories go back, but let's say I think really maybe by the time I was 10 or 12, that I've got really strong memories and really starting to actually think about things. Well, Boris would have been in his mid 60s by
Mm.
then, a much older man. And I think the older brothers, John and Sam, they worked with their father. They kind of knew him well. So they would have had both less need to discover dad, and two, maybe they knew dad better and therefore had less desire to know that side of him, a potential revenge side of him, in too much detail.
Documentary filmmaking is always interesting because you're filming real life, and in real life, anything can happen. I read that you said that this film was especially difficult for you because this story goes in all different paths that you can easily just keep walking down and finding even more revelations and more revelations, more revelations. How did you go about making sure that you're just focused on the central theme of Boris and not get too sucked in with the other things? Because you can easily go down a rabbit hole with so many other places in this movie.
Yeah, that was the big challenge with this film. And in that regard, from a documentary filmmaking point of view, it's probably been the toughest film I've made because the story kept opening up into all these ways, not necessarily directly connected to my core character, Boris and his family, but related to the broader story. And to be honest, my editor, an English guy, Hugh Williams, he, every time I would say, let's do this, let's talk about
Mm.
this Nazi or this killing or this suspicious incident, he'd just say, okay, how do we bring this back to Boris? Like, bring this back to Boris. Because otherwise, from a storytelling point of view, you got a danger of losing your audience. So, I was making a documentary film. I wasn't writing the definitive book or encyclopedia of Nazis in Australia and what happened to them. So it was just a matter of, for example, at the end of the film, I'll just give you an example. So at the end of the film, we have two stories of a couple of incidents of things that happened, particular things that happened to Nazis, or three cases of different things that happened to different Nazis. I've got so many stories that are not in the film. I'll give you one, right? In the 1959 to 1960, five Lithuanian war criminals died in car accidents in and around Melbourne. And you go, blimey, Lithuanians are bad drivers, right?
Mm.
And then, so we thought, it's a bit suspicious. Let's see what we can find here. Unfortunately, many of the coronial and police documents have simply been lost and don't exist. But there was one file about a Nazi in Footscray, and turns out that this Nazi died in a car accident, and the driver who accidentally killed him was a Mr. Cohen. And you go, what are the odds, right? A Nazi and a Mr. Cohen. I guess it could happen. You get pretty high odds, but it can happen. Then it turns out that Mr. Cohen was a Holocaust survivor.
Mm.
And you go, we'll never know, right? Because Mr. Cohen's family didn't want to talk to me, but we'll never know. But I would put my house, I'd place a bet on this. But again, it was another story, a great story. So we just had to be discerning. And to be honest, every documentary is about making choice, every film, but every documentary in particular is about making choices. And ultimately, you have dozens of hours of footage and archive, and you just chip away until you hope you've made the right choices. And I'm not sure if you ever do 100%, or at least as a filmmaker, I'm never 100%. I've done that, but so far, in the festival screenings we've had, the audience reaction seems to be positive.
Please support Matt's movie reviews on Patreon. Get access to exclusive content, request movie reviews and top 10 lists, and help support my work. Please click on the Patreon link in the description below. You mentioned just before Nazis in Australia. That was really incredibly shocking to me when I was watching the documentary, because the thinking always is, especially in pop culture, oh, the Nazis fled to Argentina. Or, you think of movies like The Boys in Brazil, you're like, oh, things like that. You don't think, maybe in, Darling Harbour or in Footscray or stuff like that, like something, so someone could be there. Um, how much of a shock was it to you? And also, do you know whether this was something that was um, specific to Australia? Do you know if other allied countries also had this kind of problem as well?
Yes, yes. Other Allied countries also had Nazis in their midst. Other Allied countries also employed Nazis as Cold War spies. I think there was what's slightly different about the Australian experience is the number of war criminals who came here, because essentially there was a mass migration of Baltic refugees, people who were not prepared to live under Soviet rule for a range of reasons. And one of those reasons for some of those Baltic individuals was because, well, they'd been allied with the Nazis, killing people, and the Soviets wouldn't give them much of a pleasant homecoming. The scale of collaboration in the Baltic countries was massive. The scale, it seems like, putting it into percentages seems demeaning in a way, but the number of Jews who died in Lithuania, for instance, was the highest of any community in Europe, which is really saying something. We're talking about 96%. Imagine if 96% of Australians, I don't know, what would that be, 22 million people, were wiped out basically like that. And it happened, sure, the Nazi Germany led it, but it was only possible because of the wide-scale local collaboration. So, one, we're talking about the scale of the community who came out, the type of community that came out. And then, of course, we have this unique situation that more Holocaust survivors came to Australia per capita than any other country outside of Israel.
Yeah.
So this led to a situation where literally we would have, there are multiple examples of Holocaust survivors who saw the killers of their families on the street, who saw SS guards over their garden fences, who saw Nazis from the camps they were interned in on the buses. So what do you do when you're confronted with such a scenario? What do you do when you go to a government and the government does nothing? What do you do when the government is actually protecting Nazis, not just doing nothing? Now, I met Holocaust survivors who to this day say, I saw this Nazi and I should have killed him. But killing someone's a big deal, and they were just not killers. They couldn't do it. As a teenager growing up in London, there was a war crimes investigation in the 1980s. And I wrote, my first probably creative work I wrote was a fictionalized story of some teenage Jewish guy who goes out and kills a Nazi. But I put that down on paper. I couldn't actually go out and do it, even if I felt the Nazi deserved to be knocked off. So what do you do? And then there's someone like Boris. The difference is he's a Nazi killer. He was a partisan. I've seen his Soviet records, which list the battles he was in, the number of Nazis he killed. He speaks openly about it himself. So then you're getting into different territory. You know the government's doing nothing about it. Imagine the trauma and despair. We're talking about this in 2023. These were incidents that were happening when the events of World War II were fresh and at the forefront of people's minds. What do? And you got someone like Boris, who you go to, who you turn to, and ultimately he may have done whatever he did.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by TeePublic. TeePublic is the world's largest marketplace for independent creators to sell their work on the highest quality merchandise. With over 1.2 million designs, TeePublic is sure to have something you love. I think in the movie it was Boris's son John who talked about there was a war after the war. And I think from my perspective, a lot of that comes down to not only the experience that Boris and his brother and other people had as well, but also I think there's like an everlasting trauma that came with that as well, right? I mean, these are really incredible traumatic experiences. And I think a lot of ways people, Holocaust survivors, kind of dealt with those experiences in a kind of therapeutic way was telling their stories in, for example, at the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne. They tell the stories on camera and such. When you yourself as a Jewish man and you watching these stories from generations before, a couple of generations before you, and you hear these stories and you are doing your research and such, is there something that happens to you within yourself, not as a filmmaker, but as a person, as before the movie to after the movie? Because I'm sure before the movie you will have seen and heard a lot of things as well, but once you started getting into the grittiness of many of the experiences that a lot of these people had from Boris downwards, I can only imagine the kind of the changes that could happen to you personally and spiritually.
Yes. Well, I mean, it forced me to meaningfully confront the moral question of revenge, and how I perceive that. And I've got no qualms revealing my hand. I'm on Boris's side 100%. I think I'm on Boris's side in the own right of the story, and I'm on Boris's side when I see my family on my mother's side were all wiped out in Lithuania in the Holocaust. Just my grandmother survived because she got to Europe, to the UK before the war. No one survived. I grew up with no family on that side. And you don't appreciate that absence of something because it's not there until something causes you to realize that that's actually abnormal. And when I was looking for archive for this film of death pit killings, because it's important to point out that this was the Holocaust by bullets. This preceded the final solution, transporting people on trains, sticking them in ovens and up chimneys. I came across a photo of the killings of the death pit of my own family in Lithuania. And that was really, I mean, I've been to Lithuania and made a film about it, but just a stumble, I've never seen this photo before of the killings in process. Like they could be members of my family standing there, lined up, waiting to be shot. And it's probably impossible to find anything more sobering than that. And it does cause you, I think you're right, it does cause you to question a whole range of facts in terms of, where you belong, who you trust, and the precariousness of life, and then your own position on the moral question, because I think the two are connected. How you understand that history and the reaction and you and your families and communities' place in it. And then that leads you to respond to the moral question. But the trauma, the issue of trauma, when you make a film, a documentary film, one of the mantras out there is, prepare, have your plan, and then rip it up the day you start shooting. And I wasn't expecting this story of intergenerational trauma to be so strong. And that was probably a bit naive of me, really. And it's like, how could it be otherwise? When you grow up exposed to, particularly the older brothers, Sam and John, saw and witnessed, they had the survivors coming around the whole time. They would be talking about their stories the whole time. Growing up with that, it's well recognized that there is Holocaust trauma in the, living aside epigenetics, in the second generation. and that's true in the third generation as well. So I could have made a film that could have, we're talking before about what do you focus on? The trauma, I could have made a film just about that. But it's important that we got it in there so just people could see it, because I think that trauma explains the reaction to it. And going back to one of your earlier points, I think Jack had less of it than his older brothers. I don't know if that's answered your question or not, or I've just been
No,
rambling.
it's really well said, and I think also considering the recent developments of what's been happening in Israel and such. I mean, there was a moment in the movie when I forgot who Sam was talking to, but it might have been one of the founders of the Holocaust Museum in Melbourne. He was talking about the brutality that the Lithuanians had in regards to the slaughter of Jewish babies, and then I couldn't help but think, this isn't the past. This is still happening now. This just happened last month, 2 months ago, and it's something that's going to come up over and over again. And I just don't know how, like, I don't know if anyone knows how to kind of confront that and how to get rid of that, because it just seems to me that that hatred, that evil is just insidious in kind of eternal in a sort of way. So I think it's going to be, I mean, I can only imagine what screenings were like for you when you were showing this, because it would
Well,
have
I'll
been
tell you
something else.
something. I'll tell you something. The film had its premiere at the Australian Jewish Film Festival, and then I was also in the UK where it had its premiere, British premiere, at the UK Jewish Film Festival. And we're talking about a Jewish specific crowd. But for me, two things. One, there are photos in there death pit photos in there that I would have seen literally hundreds of times in the selecting of archive and the editing of this film. I looked at them through a whole new prism. They weren't just the past, they were the present as well. They were the kids at the Nova dance party in southern Israel who were slaughtered in the sand dunes of the beach on October 7th. When who would have thought that we're having this conversation in early December 2023, we would be talking about, or we would have in our very recent past, a matter of weeks, we would have scenarios of Jewish babies being burned. And, for the Jewish audiences, there was a real resonance because we thought the events of the Boris had to deal with and his community had to deal with ended in 1945. That's what we thought. That's why the Jewish world is so traumatized at the moment, because October 7 happened with the Hamas attacks and all the war crimes. And it's like, whoa, it's still going on. It's not a part of my grandmother's history. It's now part of my history, lived experience in terms of time. When parents are hiding in cupboards, trying to keep their hands over the mouths of their babies and children to keep them quiet, because there are people banging at the door who want to come in and kill them. Well, that's straight out of the Holocaust playbook, right? And so for audiences, I had to say, this film may be triggering for you. I had to literally stand up in front of these crowds, not because of Holocaust trauma, but because of October 7 Hamas trauma.
Yeah.
And had the film come out a year earlier, it would have been seen and understood, and its resonance would have been different. And of course, it's just hugely tragic. One of the massive things to come out of October 7 has been the silence of women's groups in the West to all the rapes that happened on October 7. Something that's I just cannot comprehend at all. No, not the rapes, the silence in response to the rapes by women's groups. And it reminds me, and here is that resonance of, the silence of the Western world when the Holocaust was happening. They knew it was happening. Now, it's not the same. October 7 was not the Holocaust. But in terms of imagery, resonance, similarities, trauma, there's a lot going on. And I think now one of the things, and it's separate story to the documentary, but one of the things is that we were now the third, I'm second, I'm in my case, third generation from the Holocaust. Jack and his brothers were second generation from the Holocaust, parents of survivors. Their children were third generation. And you just kind of, as we thought we were getting away from the trauma of the Holocaust, then that trauma is back and then some. And, there was a film and a book many years ago about anti-Semitism called The Longest Hatred.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been with us for a long time, and I expect it will be with us for a while yet. And the thing is, one other thing is that, we shouldn't forget that, and I think this is another reason for the resonance. People didn't believe the Holocaust could ever happen because nothing like it had ever happened before. Right? So people say, why didn't Jews resist? Well, they didn't think they were going to end up going up a chimney. No one had that such a thing hadn't happened before, right? Apart from the fact that they'd been dehumanized and diminished and physically weak and everything else before it got to that point. But one of the things is, there was a rabbi in 1934, a young rabbi who stood up in a synagogue in Berlin and said, this is all going to end badly, right? We've got to get out of here. Our lives are going to be threatened. He was kicked out of his job, couldn't get another job in the whole of Germany for being a scaremonger. He left, went to British Mandatory Palestine. He survived. Most of his congregants did not. And I think for Jewish people now, and I think one of the reasons, it's a whole separate conversation, but how did Israel, the Israeli army, this strong army, let October 7 happen? And I think there's a feeling in Israel that Israel didn't take Hamas at its own word. Hamas want to rid the world of Jews, right? So we know that genocide is on the agenda, right? But now we know that it's happened. Such a thing is possible. And it's happened still within lived memory. So, yeah, I think, the resonance of the film, the continuation of the trauma that may have been ending is now, unfortunately, back in quite a visceral way.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Amazon Prime Video. One of the best on-demand streaming services available, Amazon Prime Video features exclusive Amazon originals as well as popular movies and TV shows. Watch Amazon Prime Video anytime, anywhere. I think also there can be ramifications politically here in Australia in regards to the revelations, in regards to how many Nazi war criminals were allowed in Australia too. I think there could be potential for that. Maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure, but I think there can be. That being said, you said previously that you had so many other stories that you could tell, but you couldn't go down that road. Is there potential for maybe a series, I don't know, another movie or something like that, where maybe in an episodic kind of way we can look at these different stories individually about how these different Nazis came into Australia, and in regards, and also, I don't know, if we could kind of backtrack or delve into how that happened, who's responsible for that happening, etc. Because I think that's a story within its own that should be explored more.
Yeah, I suspect from a film point of view, I'm kind of done, 5 exhausting years of my life. I do believe there's a I am interested in making a podcast of this story, but it's a process of getting it commissioned, etc. So yes, and also I think the international dimensions. There were Nazi SS groups operating in Australia that had ties to Nazi SS and collaborator groups overseas. There's this whole international side to the story that we only touched upon in the film. There were Jewish survivors here liaising with Lithuanian Holocaust survivors in London, swapping information. It's a much, much bigger story. So it is one that I feel is incomplete. I'm not sure about a film just because of the sort of the reality of the process of filmmaking. But I do see it as as a podcast. Whether I'll ever make it or not, I don't know. But the other thing I should say is, I sat with my researcher, Joey Watson, in the National Archives in Canberra, and we literally had 600 thick and sometimes not so thick files of Nazis who died and disappeared mysteriously, right? They'd never been looked at before because the war crimes investigation was, if we find someone we can prosecute, we'll look into that case. If we can't find them or they're dead, there's nothing to look at.
Yeah.
No one's ever looked into the circumstance of their death or disappearance before until we came along with this film. It's beyond our capacity to look into all these cases. It requires the resources and the attention of a government to do so. And I think ultimately that's what is required if this is ever going to be, if we're ever going to really know the full scale of the truth.
Well, it's just one thread of just an incredible documentary, I got to say, Danny. Everyone out there, Revenge Our Dad, the Nazi Killer. So it's in different cinemas around Australia. You got the Randwick Ritz, you got Dendy Canberra, Dendy Corparo, a lot of places as well. Where's a good place where people can check out some sessions, screening times? Do you have a Facebook page or a website, anything like that set up for the website?
I will. That's a very good point. I will post it on Facebook, Identity Films and Productions, and I'll also put Danny Ben-Moshe, on Twitter. So yes, I will do that. And I'm not sure if enjoy is the right word of this film, but I hope viewers are engaged and stimulated and have something meaningful to reflect upon, both about the country that they live in and personally with the moral questions that unfortunately remain as relevant today as they did in the past.
Well, Danny Ben-Moshe, I thank you so very much for your time today, and thank you for your documentary. It's incredibly engrossing, and to be able to talk to you about the documentary today has been one of my highlights of the year. And I thank you so very much for that.
Well, thank you for your interest, and best of luck for all your forthcoming editions of your show.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content.